Last time we were talking about Sun Tzu, and we were discussing the basic principles by which he says we're going to judge victory and defeat. Now, I want to think in a broader context today. We're going to be talking directly about military strategy, but this is really about strategy for organizations in general and for leadership in general. And what he's thinking is, look, part of what a leader is supposed to do is actually achieve certain aims, right? We said that an organization was a group of people organized specifically with some goal in mind. It has a purpose, that's part of its very nature. And so achieving the purpose is fundamental. So when we think about how to act within an organization, Aristotle says our goal should be to live well. We might think, okay, what does that mean in this kind of context? It doesn't just mean getting along with people and following basic ethical rules and so on. It means, how do we actually achieve that purpose while doing it well, both successfully but also in a sort of moral way in a broader sense. Doing it well isn't just being effective at getting it, but also getting it in the right kind of way. So, what do we have to do? Well, Sun Tzu lays out the things that I just want to remind you what they are. They are the Tao, the moral laws, it's translated here. But that does mean we've got to understand how things ought to be as well as what they are. We have to think about heaven and earth, basically the variable conditions that are relevant to our success, and then the more or less constant, predictable, known conditions that are relevant to our success. Then we get down to the commander. So we're going to have to think about the leader, to generalize that. And then we've got the question of method and discipline. Okay, now in an army it's obvious what method and discipline are, I think, although there are many dimensions to it. But in an organization, what is method and discipline? What does that mean? What's the equivalent to having a well-trained army?
Obedient staff.
Good, it's going to be a question of your people, right? And not only are they good people, but we're going to have to think, well, let's see. Here's what he means by it. He says, the marshalling of the army in its proper subdivisions. So we're going to have to think about the method in a number of different ways. And if we focus on that, the first thing he says, look, marshalling the army in its proper subdivisions. In other words, organizations, by their very definition, right, by their very nature, are organized. And so we've got to think about the fact that, well, okay, how is this organized? So in short, we could think about, well, it's the organization of the organization. That sounds ridiculous. But in other words, what I mean is the structure. The organization chart. Is the organizational chart appropriate for the task or not? And that's something that actually people constantly monkey with, usually to no effect. Almost any consultant comes into an organization, they look at things and they say, well, you should reorganize. Lots and lots of bosses come in and they want to put their own stamp on the organization, so they reorganize. That's a question of focusing on what Sun Tzu is referring to as method and discipline. Now, in my experience, these reorganizations are usually, I'm trying to think of a word that's somewhere in between ineffective and disastrous. Bad, okay? They confuse people, they move people around in bizarre ways. It's hard to get this right. And part of the reason that I want to stress this is that I think a lot of organizations go wrong here. But it's worth reflecting a bit, because I think there's a subtle question. It's one we address a little bit right at the beginning, but it's key. You've got an organization, and it has a certain kind of structure. It has a kind of design. There's this department, that division, and so on. Now, often you look at that and you think, this doesn't make much sense to me. I don't understand why it's organized this way. If you want a simple example, look at a university and think about the various departments. Some of them are obvious, right? It's obvious that physics is different from biology, that's different from mathematics, that's different from computer science, that's different from philosophy, and so on. But even there, you can think, well, gosh, is that the right structure? In fact, it's very fashionable now to try to encourage interdisciplinary work, to talk about interdisciplinary things as if they're super cool, to have all of these programs and centers and interdisciplinary majors and things like that. And if you're going to apply for grant funding, it's especially good to say, ooh, we're interdisciplinary. Now, that's a way of saying, well, gosh, this structure is either leaving out or making difficult all sorts of cooperation that could be really fruitful. And in a lot of areas, I think that's true. In some areas, it's probably, I think interdisciplinary becomes an excuse to say, we actually don't know anything and don't follow the proper methods of any of it. But when it's done well, it means we're really drawing from a bunch of things and using what we can gain legitimately from all of them. So, in short, you can think about whether even that structure makes sense. But now move up into the tower, the administration, and often you find an organization, not just here, but in lots of organizations, you think, what's going on here? And so consultants often do that. They come in, they look, and they think, well, this doesn't make any sense. They reorganize. And usually it works out poorly. Now, the issue I'm trying to get at is, what does it mean to say this makes sense, first of all? And secondly, I guess we could say, what's the best method for making it make sense? Here's one model. You might say, there should be a careful, conscious design. We should be able to explain the structure. But look, there are different functions in the organization. This is dedicated to this function, this is dedicated to this function. Now, sometimes organizations are structured nicely by function. We have sales, we have marketing, we have accounting, and they have clearly different functions. But other times we don't seem to. For example, what's the function of a philosophy department?
To think.
Somebody smiled at me. Good question. To think, okay, I like that.
To try to answer questions like, what is the function of a philosophy department?
Right. What is the purpose of a philosophy department? Oh, that's precisely the question that is our purpose to answer. That really sounds circular and bad. When I was called upon to come up with a mission statement for the philosophy department, and I thought, okay, I've got one day to write this thing, so I spent maybe 15 minutes thinking about it. But anyway, here was what I came up with as our mission statement. Our goal is to,
Just to expand knowledge.
expand knowledge, right? To do research in philosophy. And so to try to address deep questions like what is there, how do we know, what do we do about it, etc. We are partly dedicated to that. We're partly dedicated to teaching, but that means teaching graduate students in a PhD program, but it also means teaching undergraduates, both preparing our majors well, but also teaching philosophy to non-majors, people who are really going to only take 1 or 2 philosophy courses. And those seem to be 4 different functions. Now notice we don't split up the department according to those functions. We don't say, well, you're going to teach the grad student. Actually, we sort of do. But I mean, we don't really say, you're going to teach the graduate students, you're going to teach the majors, you're going to teach the other non-major type courses, and you're going to actually engage in research. In fact, the people who, that's not to say people in the faculty don't specialize in some of these things. We have a few people who do teach, mostly grad students, and they're mostly involved in research. We have a few adjuncts who really just teach mostly the courses for non-majors and don't really engage in the other parts. But most of us do a variety of these things. And if we focus more on one or more on the other, it's usually due to personal taste, not a question of our particular function. So the structure of the department doesn't really track those functions very well. And in a certain sense, I think one wouldn't want them to. It would be strange to, well, or would it be better? Sometimes I've thought, it would be better to have certain people whose job is just to teach, and they should be focused fully on teaching. And other people whose job is to make the university famous and publish research. And they should just focus on that. What a waste of time to make them teach and grade papers and all of that. Would it be good to separate things that way or not? Yeah.
think it'd be fine, because then people, well, I mean, I can see like the drawbacks of it, but I think like, basically it makes things more efficient. Like researcher, you don't get if you have it set up this way, you won't have a chance of like a researcher who's shitty at teaching and then having an overall bad class. Like, that'll never happen.
Yeah,
because they're only focused on researching, and people that only want to teach are now only teaching.
Right. Well, good point. I mean, one thing this can allow people to do is focus. Look, my thing is teaching. That's what I do. I don't claim to have any brilliant new ideas. I'm just going to tell you really effectively what the ideas of Plato were, and Aristotle, and Kant, and so on and so forth. And other people might say, well, don't ask them to explain any of this, but they're really good at doing what they do. And actually, in the sciences, there is something like this. We do have people who work in the lab as researchers and don't teach at all. In other areas of the university, we don't really tend to do that. Now, in some ways, it's like, well, maybe that does make sense. Maybe some people could have a foot in both, but some people might be better off just focusing on one or the other. It used to be, actually, that the university system was set up that way. Colleges at the level of, and I don't mean to suggest anything about any particular institutions here, but colleges like Texas State and things, as it were, lower on the academic totem pole than that, they were dedicated to teaching. People who were hired there were expected to teach. They weren't really expected to publish anything. And the same was true of small liberal arts colleges. Your goal wasn't to publish, it was just to teach. Whereas at research universities, your goal was mostly research. And yeah, you might teach, but everybody knew, probably bad at that. Or at least nobody's going to spend much time on that. And so there was more of a function by entire organization that way. Now, all of these organizations tend to try to do everything. And even at small colleges, people want people to publish. And here, people at least claim to care about teaching, and I think most of them do. So that's something that, complicates life. Now, in academia, part of the reason I use that as an example is that I know it well, and part of it is that it's a simple example. Think about medicine. Suppose you are a doctor, a general practitioner, and think about the various things you were called upon to do, okay? Patient comes in, complains that he has a sore throat. I'm expected to talk to him, to find out something about medical history, to examine the patient, make a diagnosis. Then, on the basis of my medical knowledge, I make a prescription. Then, I actually, I have to deal with the insurance company, I have to bill the patient or the insurance company, et cetera, et cetera. It's a complicated thing. So as a physician, what am I expected to do? I'm actually expected to do a diagnosis. I'm expected to organize and manage an office. I'm expected to actually manage a staff that handles billing and dealings with all these companies and so forth. I'm expected to have enough medical knowledge up to date about that particular condition to know what it's likely to be and to know the best method of treating it, and so on and so forth. Right? All of that is complicated. You might imagine a system where different people are involved in this. My job is a diagnostician. I say, I think it's strep throat. Then I send you to that person who says, yes, I'm up to date on strep throat treatments and which kind of drugs are most useful in dealing with that. My thing is researching antibiotics. And then you might go to another person who is in charge of the office staff. And in short, the diagnostician might know actually very little about which pharmacological products are best for treating this in the current situation. And they might know nothing about managing the office. But as it happens, a lot of jobs involve a lot of those things. Think about being a pastor of a church. What are you expected to do? You're expected to manage a staff and so sort of be a business person.
Be nice to everyone.
You've got to be nice to everyone and act like a psychological counselor, a grief counselor, a marriage counselor, all of this. You're supposed to be a biblical scholar and come up with brilliant insights to preach about every Sunday morning. You've got to be an effective public speaker. Who can do all that, right? And a lot of jobs are like that. So you might think, look, there are several issues here. One is do we want to have this designed, and is it a proper thing to have it designed by function? How specialized should it be? There's this question of evolution. Organizations evolve to deal with various problems that handle functions. And so we've got the question of, to what extent do we think it makes sense? To what extent should we just let the organization evolve in ways that are responding to real problems? And then, of course, we do have this question of generalization versus specialization. How specialized do we want people in the organization to be? How flexible and so forth? A lot of organizations engage in cross-training employees. So yes, this is primarily your job, but you will act as understudy for that job, okay? And sometimes even whole departments are like that. All right, this department works on that, but this department needs to know enough about it to sort of understand what's going on with it, and so on. Do we care about that, or do we want to look at specialists? Anyway, these are complicated questions, and I want to just point out, this is a subtler question than a lot of people think. How do we organize an organization, and should we worry if we look at it and it doesn't make any sense to us? Maybe it evolved. Look at it this way. You look at something like a human hand, and you think, I don't understand the structure. I get the opposable thumb thing. What if I didn't have that? Actually, injure your thumb sometime and you realize, oh crap, how do I even button a shirt, right? That happened to me. I got de Quervain syndrome from attacking a rusty screw and losing my fat battle. So for about 6 months, I was in intense pain, and it was awful. I mean, not all the time, just whenever I'm trying to move my thumb. So yeah, just getting dressed in the morning was a form of torture. It was awful. And then, by the way, talk about medical practitioner. Doctor completely misdiagnosed it, but nevertheless had me fixed within a week. Okay? Because he just told me, do this, do that. After a few days, the pain went away. It was awesome. So, if your wrist ever starts hurting, your thumb ever starts hurting, just do that. It's great. Anyway, if I know, I mean, my wife had been telling me for 6 months, go to the doctor. And it's just a tendon problem, not that to do. Well, actually, there's something super simple to do. In any event, the whole idea is, well, how generalized, how specialized do we want people to be? And to some extent, that means how finely grained do we want to think of these functions? How general should the functions be? And should we care that we look at something like the structure of hand and say, well, that makes sense, but why are there? I mean, why aren't we like cartoon characters who have only 3 fingers on the thumb? Okay? Why not have an extra one? In fact, there are some people who have a 6th finger right when they're born. Like the 6-fingered man in The Princess Bride. And they usually cut that off. Because it's like, oh, first thing people say is, oh, 10 fingers, 10 toes. No, 11 fingers. Well, let's get rid of one. But like, why? Who cares? Right? I mean, does it matter if you have 5? Wouldn't an extra one be actually really cool for playing the piano and so on? So anyway, I don't know. But on the other hand, am I going to second guess evolution? Should I start saying, well, look, I mean, Bart Simpson does fine with 1 fewer finger, so why don't we start chopping pinkies off of all babies? It's like, we don't do that. We did that with some dogs, right? I mean, an Australian Shepherd is born, and they usually put a thing around its tail so the tail drops off. That didn't happen to my Australian Shepherd. It's a beautiful tail, but they do that most of the time. And, like, why? It evolved with a tail. And then some consultant comes in and says, oh, we'd be better without a tail. Well, are you willing to say I can out-design evolution? And if you think about it biologically, you're usually going to say, well, no, evolution probably knew what it's doing, though it's not absolutely efficient and it can get stuck in suboptimal states. Well, the same question arises in organizations. Now, what else is involved in this? The gradations of rank among the officers. So part of the organizational structure is the division, right? In other words, having this group, this group, this group. But part of it is then having a hierarchical structure. So typically these might report, for example, to someone here, and then this one might report to someone who coordinates those people and so forth. And in short, we have some hierarchy. So this has, you might say, here we're focusing on the division, but there is also this question of the hierarchy. Who reports to whom? Who's supervised by whom? And that makes a big difference. Suppose you've got a job and your success, your chances of advancement, your salary, everything else depends on how pleased the boss is with you. Matters a lot who your boss is, right? I've worked with people that I got along great with and were great bosses. I've worked for people who were awful bosses. And so it makes a huge difference. So you have to think, well, now to some extent that's just a question of how good the leader is, but it's also a question of the hierarchy, right? The command and the sense in which there is actually a hierarchical structure. The maintenance of roads, by which supplies may reach the army, and control of military expenditure. So what is the organizational equivalent of the maintenance of roads, by which supplies may reach the army? Yeah.
The logistics.
Yeah. The logistics. A question of, supply. There has to be some input. The function of the organization, there's going to be some output, whether it's a product or a service, or for that matter, just some kind of achievement, something. It's doing something, right? And presumably there's some input to that process. Well, managing these inputs and actually guaranteeing that you are capable of doing what you're doing. After all, the roads are important not only for bringing supplies to the army, but then moving the army. And so it's a question of really thinking, can we do it? Can we get the needed inputs for whatever our function is? And then, once we produce that, can we actually get it to market? So we need to think about supply, we need to think about actually being able then to accomplish whatever we're going to accomplish. And that last thing then, control of expenditure. Well, budgets. So this last part is going to have to do with all of that. Now, in a military context, he says the crucial question is here. On which side is discipline most rigorously enforced? So in the military, it's very important that you tell people to do something and they do it. You say, all right, you are going to march in that direction and then attack from the rear. Well, what if you tell that to the philosophy department? They're going to be, why? What is it? What do you mean that direction? How far, right? What is the rear anyway? What is it to be the rear of an object? Well, this must entail there's a front of the object. Et cetera, et cetera. You can imagine that the philosophy department wanders off thinking. Maybe you've seen the Monty Python skit of a soccer game between the Greek philosophers and the German philosophers, and everyone simply wanders around the field going like this. So discipline does matter in that context. Now, is there an equivalent in an average organization? I mean, there's surely something like discipline. People tell me I'm teaching this class at 12 noon. I've got to show up, right? And so discipline, even in a philosophy department, matters to some degree. I did have one professor in grad school who, I think our seminar was, it was scheduled for 3:30 to 6. And he often didn't show up for at least an hour after class was scheduled to start. So you'd sit there, and how long do you wait for a professor if no one shows up?
15 minutes.
15 minutes, all right, that's interesting. Yeah, we would sit there and wait, and okay, it's 3:45, still no professor. It's 4, still no professor, what do we do? It's 4:15. I remember one time, finally at 4:30, we said, So we all walked out to the elevator to leave and got off the elevator. So class started at 4:30. That day it was 4:30 to 7, I guess. And some of us had a class at 7 to 10. So that was like, oh well. So much for food.
But anyway, that was, ordinarily you want people actually to show up. Which army is stronger? And so that's going to be really an output of all of this. On which side are officers and men more highly trained? And where is there greater constancy in reward and punishment? Now, there are several things then that are being introduced here that are in addition to, or maybe they're outcomes of all of this. One of them is training. How effective are people at doing their jobs? How well trained are they? Do they know what to do? And what about rewards and punishments? Let me put it this way, more broadly. Are the incentives properly structured to get the outcome that you want? There are a lot of organizations where, first of all, people aren't really trained at all. They're just brought in and put at a desk and told, do this. And they may or may not have any idea how to do it. But there's also this question of incentives. You've got to tie the incentives to the function. You've got to think, well, what do I want these people to do? What do I want to reward? And how constantly will that be rewarded? Or is it a matter of hit and miss? So you have to think about giving people incentives to do the thing you want them to do. So, how do you do that typically? By the way, when I teach this course to graduate students who have been in the working world for a while, this is one of the things that most resonates with them, that they most complain about, you might say. Not about my teaching of it, about the real world implementation of it. Performance evaluations and incentives drive people crazy. Because after all, to reward you for doing something well, I have to know if you've done it well, right? So what's involved in this, in part, is evaluating people's performance. How well are you doing? And that's super hard to do well. And a lot of organizations do it terribly. I'll warn you right now, you're too young to have seen this yet. Though maybe you've seen it in another form. I mean, how effective is grading at actually assessing what you know? Well, in some classes, I hope it's really good at that, and in some classes, it's terrible. I know there were courses I took where I thought, gosh, what's in the book has nothing to do with what goes on in class. What goes on in class has nothing to do with what's on the exams. The grade I get seems to me to have nothing to do with how well I actually did on that exam. It was all over the place. And so it's very hard to do this well. And it's also hard to have then incentives that are properly tied to that. Yeah.
This seems analogous to the good money, bad money problem, where there's no way to tell if it's good money or bad money, or there's no way to enforce getting good money, and so people will only offer bad money if they're given the choice.
Okay, good, yes. It is a bit like the Gresham's Law problem. Bad money drives out good. So similarly, you might think, bad employees drive out good. Bad performance evaluations drive out good. Bad consultants drive out good, and so forth. Now, they don't all have exactly the same structure, but I think you're right. There's an analogous problem here. Suppose you've got an organization where actually the incentives aren't structured correctly, or they're structured correctly except that what they're tied to is a performance evaluation that doesn't make any sense. Then what do we do? Well, you might think, look, I come in, I am in a situation where I'm trying to meet a measure that doesn't really make any sense. So what do I do? Well, I've got a choice, right? I can either honestly try to achieve the functions of the organization, or realize then I've got to at best fake it with respect to the things that are these dimensions on which I'm to be evaluated. Or I have to focus on those things instead of what I'm really supposed to be doing. And you might think, okay, so I have a choice to make. Now, what do I get rewarded on? The person who is evaluating me looks at this. Maybe they realize the whole structure is stupid, and so let's ignore that and assess how good this person is on their real job. Or well, let's just follow the form and do what I can explain and check off and blah, 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 blah. And you might think, I've got, the good money here would be, I focus on my real job. This is fluff on the side. And the person evaluating me realizes, yes, this form is nonsense. Forget it. Just focus on how good the person really is. But that's the equivalent of both buyer and seller having good money. And as we saw, there's actually a strong incentive not to do that, right? I would rather, well, what would I rather do? I'd rather do what I'm really supposed to do, maybe. Depends. What are these other things I'm expected to do? Are they easier for me to accomplish, or are they harder? They're usually easier. I'll tell you a secret. Suppose you're a professor who actually cares about teaching evaluations. Let's say you're coming up for tenure. You want the student evaluations to be good. How do you accomplish that? Well, you try to teach well, but given that you're teaching how you teach as well as you can, what else can you do? Yeah.
Just being enthusiastic.
Be enthusiastic, that helps.
Give
Yeah.
good grades.
Give good grades, yes.
I just think like be open to suggestions, like let the students, like listen to the students' feedback.
Okay, listen to student feedback, absolutely.
Last semester, I had my nutrition professor just, out of the blue, gave us candy right before.
Buy them off with candy, get people in a good mood. Yes, that's a good idea.
My professor gave us extra credit for filling out your evaluation.
Extra credit for filling out the evaluation. We're not supposed to know whether you filled out the evaluation. That's sort of weird, but okay. Yeah.
I was going to say it's advising grades then.
Okay, yeah. My technique was to just give people an assignment that was really easy just before the evaluations, and so they'd just be getting back something in which everybody did well. And so right at the beginning of that class, you get the quiz back or the paper back. It's like, I got an A. I love this class.
The evaluation, got C's.
That's right, then the final exam. Wow. No, when I got tenure, I decided, I'm not playing these games anymore, so I stopped doing that. And in fact, once I brought Round Rock donuts to the final exam, and one student actually made some comment on Facebook, I think it was, or whatever, just saying, wow, he brought donuts to the final exam after we filled out the evaluation. So that was like, this was sincerely nice instead of bribery. Yeah.
Well, I've seen the other way, kind of guilt tripping, where just know that your student evaluations have power.
Oh, yes.
Actually, same professor. She's like, guys, she's like, I've been working really hard trying to do this.
Oh, right.
And she straight up said, this evaluation determines whether I still work here.
Oh, wow.
The worst part though is that we had a group chat and we were like, man, she's not working here next year. She's one of the worst professors I've ever had.
Really? Oh, wow.
She's giving out candy nutrition
See,
class.
so you shouldn't hear that.
What? So, go ahead. Sorry.
You shouldn't tell your students that your job is on the line if you piss them off all year.
Well, if you're, that's true. And if you're a good teacher, why is your job on the line? I mean, you're not on the borderline, right? That's why students who come in and say, but look, I'm on the borderline of flunking out, even though I do well in all my other classes except yours. I think, my class alone can't be the reason you're worried about having a low GPA. Anyway, so back to this. You might say, look, the performance evaluation, first of all, it's hard to do it well. It's easy to have incentives that go in a strange direction that either aren't leading to the purpose of the organization or actually work against it. But then in addition to that, you've got the problem of gaming the system. And that is something that's very hard to defeat. The moment you pin down, and often people want these to be objective. They say, well, the problem with this in a lot of organizations is far too subjective. We actually have to have measures. And so it's become commonplace now to say, okay, you're managing this group. For each person you have to say, what are the dimensions along which they will be evaluated? You come up with anywhere from 3 to say, 7, 8 dimensions. Often it's around 5. And you say, all right, here are your tasks. We're going to be evaluating on these 5 things. And then you assign them numbers. And then those numbers are added up, and that determines your performance score, right? Well, here's the problem with that. Often, and people will do the same thing in hiring, by the way. Job interviews, they'll be setting up the same thing. Okay, how are these various things? The problem is, it often doesn't go that way. So people who know the system can game the system. Suppose, for example, I am interviewing for a job, and I know your company has this checklist. You're looking for certain things. Then I can, in my interview, stress exactly those things. Let's see. One of the things on your form is, being friendly, personable. Hey, how you doing, right? Is it thoughtful, reflective? Hello, how do you do? And by the way, this has nothing to do with a formal evaluation, but when I was interviewing for jobs many, many years ago, one of my interviews was with a university. I thought it was my worst one. I thought it went terribly. There were these long pauses. They asked really hard questions. I was, sometimes thinking before I answered quite a while. And some of them were very funny and lots of back and forth. This one was more like, I felt like I'd really been grilled. It was very difficult. It turned out that I was one of their top 2 candidates. And I was really shocked by that. It's like, wait, why? And one of my professors who talked to someone there said, oh, well, it was because you really took questions seriously, thought hard about them, gave, serious answers. And so the fact that I was like, oh crap, I got nothing, what am I going to say? But it looked deep and reflective that, they wanted a philosopher to be. Well, I did that really well. But if you know that coming in, right, it's like, don't be glib, be very, take what they say serious. Then you can fake that. I wasn't faking it, I was really puzzled and thinking very hard. But that's the sort of thing that once you realize what the system is, you can game the system and make it look this way. So, we talked earlier about the Wells Fargo scandal. A great example of all of these points. The incentives, now here's the thing, the research group within that company understood that there are something like 8 different functions that a bank fulfills for various people. And they knew that if somebody does more than one of these, let's say, and especially more than 2, they're very likely to do the others. So what should your goal be? And somebody's trying to deal with customers and actually sell them on setting up accounts or taking out a mortgage or this type of thing. Well, try to take existing customers who have like 1 account and get them to have 1 more. If you can take that person who has the checking account and get them also to have a savings account, or also to take out a loan, or what have you, then they're very likely to do everything else through your bank. And so the goal should have been take our existing customers and get them to have some other dimension of interaction with us. And if they've got 2 of these at least, then it's very likely they'll get the others, and that's a sort of recipe for growth. So think in terms of functions, right? We want to take our customers now and have additional functions in which or additional dimensions of our relationship. Well, that's not what various subunits did. They rewarded people for just the number of accounts. Now, it's tied in some way to that. If you have a savings account and then you have a checking account, etc., okay, that's 1 more. But instead, it wasn't very directly tied to that goal. So it gave people an incentive to just multiply accounts. But once I start realizing that's the game, I can say, oh, well, yeah, you don't want 1 checking account. You want 3 checking accounts. After all, you sometimes have personal expenses, you have business expenses, that's 2. And then, I don't know, wouldn't it be nice to set up your mortgage on an automatic payment? Well, you just do that in a separate account. And it's like, well, why? But we could do that, and so all of a sudden we start having lots of them. That didn't help the bank. In fact, in a lot of cases, it harmed the bank. It creates extra paperwork and all of that. But nevertheless, that's what people were evaluated on. That's what the incentive was. So it's very important to have the incentives tied to the ultimate goal. And it's very easy, but unfortunate, to set up an evaluation system that both measures the wrong thing and then also can be gamed so that people start doing dumb things in response to it.